We're not here to learn about the bus schedule or the religious norms in the place where you hope to visit. We're here to help you learn about your cultural identity before you go. And that way you'll be able to recognize their cultural identity and get your bearing once you settle. Now, if you've been in the US for very long, one of the biggest characteristics of our culture is its invisibility, its silence. We often don't even know how to define American culture. In fact, our culture is sort of built on things we all know about, but we deliberately don't talk about. Think about the word patriot as just one example. Everyone defines it differently, and what some people call patriotism, others might actually call treason or traitorous. But we seldom take the time to talk about those obvious differences. Instead, we all just assume we're right and the other people are using the word incorrectly. That's US cultural identity. The assumption that that gap in between meanings is just acceptable and normal. A related concept is the idea of the United States being the greatest place on earth. America is the best, as we've all heard. Now, I don't mind if you think the United States is the best country on earth, but I encourage everybody to make sure you think about finishing that sentence. We often fail to say what it is we're so good at, and that's part of that silence I'm talking about that's built into US culture. It works best if we don't talk about it at all, and instead we just keep saying that we're the best at everything, because otherwise we might get critical of things on which we still have a lot of work left to do. One of the themes of this class, perhaps the most important, is Socrates' advice to, above all else, know thyself. In a culture like the United States, that can be difficult. We've been taught to think of US culture as a melting pot, even though, as Gary Weaver pointed out this week, it's better thought of as a salad bowl. And we all know this. We all know that there aren't all-country restaurants, but rather individual Spanish food restaurants or Greek food restaurants. Same with radio or television stations. We don't mix those things into a melting pot so much as put them close to each other and call it good enough, at least as long as we don't talk about it, again with that silence. So we'll keep coming back to that idea in this class, know thyself. A few concepts to consider from the first few weeks of reading. Cosmopolitanism does not mean being accepting of globalization, and it doesn't mean being critical of it. It simply means being, first and foremost, a citizen of the world, and then, maybe, a citizen of the United States after that, or a citizen of Denver, or a citizen of the church, or of your community. It means recognizing that no matter what, our actions have effects far outside of our immediate circle. You can think of how globalization works differently for different people, and that a question like, is a steel tariff a good idea or a bad idea, can't be answered without leaning on one's personal stake in the market. If you're a steel worker in the United States, then you probably love the idea of a steel tariff because you'll be assured a job and maybe even a raise. If you're a steel worker somewhere else, you probably hate the idea. If you're a steel distribution center in the United States, you might be on the fence. There might be goods and bads involved in it. And if you're an unconnected consumer, you might not care at all, at least not until it personally affects you. Say your car or computer becomes more expensive. The story you'll read at the beginning of Apaya's article, The Case for Contamination, is a great example of what we mean by globalization and contamination. They sound like bad things, especially contamination, but it isn't always a bad thing necessarily. And although in this class one of our main goals is cultural criticism, pointing to the parts of any system which still have room for improvement, that's only because in so doing, it becomes easier to recognize other aspects of our culture which we might otherwise just miss. Again, especially in the United States, one of our big aspects of our cultural identity is not talking about our cultural identity. Bobby Harrow's cycle of socialization, which you'll read about this week as well, is a great way to think about your social identity. There is some differences between your cultural identity and your social identity, and those differences are important. In a couple weeks, you'll be writing a paper specifically about your social identity, which has to do with how your close circle taught you to see your culture. While you might have had a lot in common with a huge group across your country or your religion who all have the same cultural identity, your social identity has to do with how your parents' religion affected their rules concerning laws or friends, or how you were allowed to dress. Rock and roll might be a cultural identity, but a specific band like Skynyrd or Oasis is more of your social identity. We all eat and sleep and have sex and make music. That's what being human is. Your cultural identity is how you do all of those things generally. but your social identity is how you've made your style unique in an effort to fit in with your friends and family's beliefs and attitudes. The two are closely related, and you'll understand more after reading the articles from this week, but hopefully that helps. One of the other things Gary Weaver talks about in the article is the idea of a cultural iceberg, which is a great way to think about our beliefs and attitudes in both cultural identities and social identities. What is visible and often simplified, like a tag on a piece of clothing, say a swoosh, that's the tip of the iceberg, and it's often misleading. But beneath the surface are all these thoughts and memories which inform the cross you wear as jewelry or the cuss words you deploy at certain times. That's why they can mean different things to different people, and that's why they're both cultural identities, but specifically, depending on the reason you wear that cross or say that word, social identities. Depending on where you travel abroad, in New Zealand and Australia especially, some feminized curse words are much more common and acceptable than they are in the United States, and those who use them are simply reflecting their cultural identity. When you get there, if you come from a culture where that's not the norm, you'll likely find your cultural identity clashing with theirs, and you'll have to figure out a way to navigate that. Back to the stories we tell ourselves about the world and our silence as cultural identity. Weaver is going to touch on U.S. history and how the United States has, from day one, been a group of people who do some pretty nasty things. And those things cause us to fear retribution. But we tend to blame others for that ongoing fear. We build tons of bombs and guns every year, more than we spend on healthcare actually. But we don't claim to do it because of all the people we've killed in the past. We claim to do it because we're the world's law keepers, or we use some other method of rationalizing our interference in the world. Again, this isn't about whether or not instances where the U.S. bombs other countries is right or wrong. I have a hard time rationalizing any case of murder, even in the name of a greater good, so I'm the wrong person to put in charge of this debate. The point is, it's impossible to ignore the fact that when we kill one person, even if it was righteous and warranted, the people who come to see that person as a martyr often come to be lifelong enemies of us. When we kill one person, we often make 10 enemies. But again, we don't talk about it. And in fact, talking about it at all can be seen as unpatriotic. Alright, one more thing before we leave. Think about yourself as a drawing and how, as time changes, you would base your drawing on different experiences and memories. You would literally draw different aspects of yourself. It might be different hair, different clothing, or different hobbies you do. Say a soccer ball at one time. Maybe you smoke at some point in your life, so you would draw yourself with cigarettes, or you drink heavily at another point. We're different people at different times, and those differences come from our memories. Now think about drawing a normal person. If I said just draw a person. If you live in the US and I didn't specify anything else, like say draw a person who is using a wheelchair to get around, a normal person in your mind is probably what Tatum described this week. White, 18 to 38 years old, male, able-bodied, Christian, middle class, heterosexual, married, 2.3 kids, all that stuff. The reason we feel that way is because it's what we see over and over on TV and film, radio and text. The norm is who advertisers target in their ads. And if it's done well, we don't even notice it. And again, in the United States, that is part of our culture. We're not supposed to notice it or talk about it. The first rule of Fight Club is never talk about Fight Club. Please make sure you're taking the time to complete the assignments every week, including the readings. You're going to struggle a lot with the quizzes and the writing assignments if you don't. As you check out Part 1, your next big assignment, please reach out if you have any questions.